sharing some of our findings from looking at the QNX operating system. Okay, that seems to work. So, why did we decide to look at QNX? Initially, we started with a main focus on Blackberry 10 OS, mostly because it's an attractive target. There is not a lot of public research on this topic, and it's also a good idea to look at a Ubuntu target. Okay, better?
Yeah, that's working now.
Okay. So we decided to look at Blackberry 10 OS, but we quickly realized that Blackberry 10 OS runs QNX under the hood. Basically, Blackberry 10 OS is a modified version of QNX. So we had to get familiar with a bunch of concepts from the QNX operating system. Most of these concepts, to be honest, I've never seen before. And that's the reason we had to learn the QNX operating system, how it works. Today's talk will cover some QNX architectural differences from major operating systems. Then I'll quickly talk through attacking some of these core QNX mechanisms, such as QNX messaging and QNX persistent publish subscribe. Alex Plaskett will then follow with setting up your own exploit dev environment for QNX, debugging QNX, and writing some codes to actually trigger some of the crashes we found. So why is QNX security important? QNX is known to power various safety and mission critical systems, such as nuclear power plants, warehouse control systems, air traffic control systems, and others. Some of the clients that have publicly stated they rely on QNX to power their nuclear power plants are Westinghouse and Atomic Energy of Canada, just to name a couple of them. So, as you can imagine, it's quite important for an operating system powering a power plant to be as robust as possible. Quick look at QNX from a kind of historic point of view. There has been a handful of CVIDs, and that is public bugs, but most of these bugs have nothing really to do with the QNX core mechanisms we'll be looking at. Like some of these bugs are typical bugs for any kind of Unix operating system. As you can see, the majority of these bugs have been related to SHUID binaries and problems with them. So again, none of these really was found in a core QNX mechanism. Some of the most notable bugs in the past been found in QCondor, which is service used by developers to remotely deploy applications on QNX, debug their applications, but basically exposes some sort of IDE, remote IDE connection for developers. PhotoNG has been a major source of problems for QNX in the past. PhotoNG is the micro GUI, basically desktop environment for QNX, and it used to ship with a bunch of SHUID binaries, and these binaries been a huge problem for QNX in the past. So we found a bunch of problems by doing code review for QNX, because QNX was at some point open sourced in 2007 and remained open source and available for public access until late 2011, I think, when Blackberry acquired QNX software systems and closed the source again. So we did some source code auditing. We identified a bunch of bugs, tried to reproduce these bugs on Blackberry, and realized by doing reverse engineering, realized that these bugs have been addressed by Blackberry. So a bunch of issues been found internally and fixed without really notifying the public. Another notable vuln that's been found is the one used for jailbreaking the Playbook. Playbook was a tablet running Blackberry OS, Blackberry 10 OS. And the problem with this one was related to the fact that Blackberry was not performing integrity checks on the backup files that are created. You can back up your Playbook, you can then take the backup file, unzip it, whatever, decompress it, modify it, and feed it back to the Playbook that will happily process your backup file and basically alter some sort of system files. And the way they achieved the jailbreak was by modifying the Samba config file and letting the Samba daemon execute some arbitrary commands. A lot of hardening has been done in QNX before it kind of forked into Blackberry 10 OS. Again, Blackberry 10 OS is a majorly hardened version of QNX. A lot of improvements been done, a lot of security mitigations been implemented, such as ASLR, guard pages, stacking heap cookies, and a bunch of others, mitigating memory corruption exploits. Process manager ability has been introduced, which is very similar in terms of concept to the Linux capabilities, if you're familiar with it. So basically, it allows a process to run as a low privilege user, but still have some access to highly privileged operations, such as binding on a port from 1 to 1024, for example. A huge improvement is stripping off the Photon micro GUI. As you saw, this has been a huge source of problems for QNX in the past, so they just decided to remove it when forking into Blackberry 10 OS. And in general, it seems like they've enforced and followed the principle of least privilege when they thought about redesigning stuff when it comes to Blackberry 10 OS. A little bit about the QNX architecture. From a high-level perspective, microkernel operating system. This means that the attack surface, the kernel attack surface is really tiny, and there is only a few things implemented in the kernel. These are threading, signaling, scheduling, and message passing, really. The rest of the functionality is provided as user-land modules that can be loaded dynamically at runtime. And because of the majority of the components running in user-land, they had to implement some sort of robust IPC mechanism that allows the user-land process to easily communicate with each other and the kernel components. So they have spent a lot of time in designing the IPC mechanisms and making sure these IPC mechanisms work as reliably as possible. The fact that a lot of these components run in userland means that if you, for example, crash network protocol stack, or if you find a bug in a file system driver, this would not result in the operating system rebooting itself. This would only result in, for example, crashing this particular userland process, which will then be easily restarted by the scheduler or whatever, the watchdog of the operating system. And again, if you compromise a network protocol stack, you won't gain high level of privileges. You will only gain the privileges of the userland process running the network protocol stack. So you would need something like a privilege escalation to further compromise the operating system. Important thing is the QNX message passing, again, as I mentioned. It's an IPC mechanism provided by QNX to allow processes to communicate in the most efficient way possible. It's implemented similar to basically a message queue, but in the kernel, and processes communicate by sending messages to each other using the message send command, message receive command, message reply command. One thing to notice, although irrelevant in this case, is that this whole process is blocking, which means that when you send a message, the process is blocking until the other process replies to this particular message. So how is this implemented? QNX allows for creating communication channels that then can later on be used by user-land processes for placing messages on these channels. So if you want to register a communication channel, you can call functions like channel create or name attach, and this will create a unique series of integers that will uniquely identify the communication channel. And on the other side, if there is a user-land process who wants to communicate with you, it will look up the channel ID and then use connect attach to attach to this particular channel and then place the message on this channel. Channel create, again, will return a unique sequence of integers. If you want to refer to this channel by, let's say, a name, you can use name attach to create the channel and give it a name. Basically, you can think of the name attach alternative as creating a kind of name to symlink to a channel that would otherwise be just a series of integers. Another thing to mention is that the process manager is bundled with the QNX kernel in what they call the module procNTO. And the process manager is in charge of really basic things like creating processes, maintaining processes states, and destroying processes. It's in charge of basically managing process attributes like user IDs, permission levels, etc. The memory management is also implemented in this procNTO module. Again, responsible for really basic and obvious things like allocating memory, serving this memory to the process, and then destroying this memory. And there is also the path name management that I'll be mentioning in a bit. So, process manager. Again, under the hood, every single thing, absolutely every single thing in QNX happens in terms of messages. So if you want to spawn a process or fork a process or any other similar event, this would involve calling a function that will then result in generating a message. In this case, let's imagine you have a user-land process that wants to allocate some memory using malloc, for example. You, as a developer, just call malloc, but under the hood, the operating system will translate the malloc function call and will basically generate a message from this malloc function and send this message over to the process manager. And in this case, the message type for this message would be memmap, basically create a memory mapping. On the other side, the process manager will be listening for messages sent by this user-land process on the channel. It will listen for these messages using message receive in, for example, a while one loop. It will handle the message, it will unpack the message, will allocate the memory, create a pointer to the newly allocated chunk of memory, and return the pointer as a message. And then the user-land process will use the message receive again, to get the reply from the process manager. It will unpack the message, extract the pointer to the chunk of memory that's been allocated, and use this pointer as the return value for malloc. But again, this is all under the hood. As a developer, you don't have to really worry about handling these messages. Path manager. Now, that's a very interesting feature and really distinct feature for the QNX operating system. In QNX, processes can actually claim responsibility for a particular subset of the file system. Now, this sounds a bit weird, but for example, when you try to access the root of the file system, there will be a process, in this case, the file system driver user-land process that will handle your request. Because this process has registered as a resource manager for the particular bit of the file system. But if you, for example, access /dev /serial1 or serial2, there will be a different process that will handle this. It won't be the process that's responsible for the file system access. It will be a different resource manager who's registered responsibility, claimed responsibility for this particular subset of the file system. Resource managers can register dynamically at runtime again and can dynamically claim responsibility for this particular subset of the file system, and then can kind of cancel this responsibility and delegate it back to the path name manager. I think I already mentioned this, but yeah, if you try and open something that's claimed by the resource manager, this resource manager will be acting as a file system driver for this particular bit of the file system. Another interesting thing, and I think the last thing to mention, is QNX persistent publish subscribe, which is object sort of database backed on the file system. It's a pseudo file system that you can find under /PPS, PPS standing for publish and subscribe. And basically, this file system will contain a bunch of files that are actually objects, and by modifying these files, you kind of modify the behavior of the operating system. It's basically used for reconfiguring the operating system on the command line. You can think of it as some sort of sysctl on Linux. So basically, modifying these values will have an impact on the behavior of the operating system. It's as easy as basically echoing some data into the object. There can be user-land processes interested in changes made to any of these objects. So if I'm a process, and I'm interested in knowing whether you want to do something with Bluetooth, I would register as a subscribed process to these Bluetooth objects. And whenever these Bluetooth objects are modified, I would act on these changes. Now, this was about all the QNX concepts that we need to get familiar with before moving forward and start attacking them, looking for problems with them. So the next bit is about attacking QNX messaging. Again, QNX messaging is just nothing but IPC. So we need to identify the channels, we need to identify the processes associated with these channels, and then we need to identify the format of messages expected on the other side of the channel in order to attack them. So to list the named channels, as I said, it could be a named channel or just a series of integers that I'll be showing in a bit. We have to look at /dev/name/ either local or global to list the local or global channels respectively. So if you do an ls on this, you would get a bunch of channels, and you can then use these channels with the connect attach function to name attach function to send messages to them. As I said, it's not necessary for a channel to have a symlink to it associated with it, to have a name associated with it. So all of the channels, absolutely all of the channels, are actually available under a /proc/mount in the form of this sort of tuple of integers that uniquely identifies the channels. An interesting fact is that if you do an ls on /proc, you won't actually see the mount as being in this folder, but if you do an ls on /proc/mount, you would actually be able to list the files, which is a bit weird. So it's kind of hidden. I guess you're not supposed to really look at it. The most basic thing is, okay, once we have a list of channels and we decide which channel we want to basically fuzz, use as a medium for fuzzing, we can attach to this channel by either using this unique series of integers or the name associated with this channel, and we can use the message send command to send whatever message we decide. Of course, we need to monitor the process on the other side of the channel for any crashes, any potentially interesting behavior that we may cause with our malformed messages. On the server side, so if you're looking into reverse engineering server-side process registering a channel, you would basically search for references to the name attach function, for example, to search for processes registering a named channel. And what it would usually look like on the server side is just basically attaching to a channel, creating a channel, and then using message receive in some sort of a loop. Next thing is attacking QNX BPS, attacking the persistent publish subscribe. First thing is to list all of the objects and the PPS that we can access, not just access, but of course write to them. So first of all, we list recursively all of these files on the PPS, check if we have write access to it, and basically spit it out in a log file. So it's important to do this from as many perspectives as possible. What I mean is, so for example, on a Blackberry 10 OS device, there would be a bunch of opportunities for executing code. There is at least 4 application types that you can deploy on a Blackberry phone. Nowadays, there is even the possibility for deploying an Android application on a Blackberry phone. So what would you do is execute this from a bunch of perspectives and then diff them all together to see what applications, what code running in which context has what sort of access to this PPS object. It's important to also check the expected format for the PPS objects that you'll be modifying. You can either do some reverse engineering or you can take a look at the documentation from QNX, because most of these objects will be documented more or less. And their documentation is actually surprisingly good for PPS. So grab the documentation, look for the messages that you want to mutate, and feed these messages to something like Redamza. Another thing, another way of extracting sample messages, example data, is to look at a bunch of the provisioning scripts provided with the, for example, Blackberry 10 OS device. A bunch of these provisioning scripts will do some sort of setup on booting the device, and they're all accessible. They will have statements like echo XYZ into /pps/whatever. So you can take this message and just start mutating it. This is just a basic example on how to use it, how to do that. This is straight from the documentation as far as I can remember, and it basically has to do with fuzzing some of the Bluetooth configuration of the device and the association request with other Bluetooth devices. So you echo this original message, pipe it into a fuzzer, mutating this message, and then redirect the output, append the output, depending on the object, to this file, target file. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll have time to talk about this, but an interesting thing from an attacker's perspective is that QNX exposes a special DOM object in the WebKit browser for Blackberry 10 OS, and this special QNX object gives access to a bunch of interesting features of the operating system. So for example, from within JS, you can instantiate this QNX object, and you can send messages using the PPS framework, or you can connect to other processes. So basically, think about the opportunity of injecting JavaScript into an application, fetching content from over the internet, injecting this JavaScript into a web view, and then from the web view, you can escalate to, let's say, some code execution by sending an exploit over to the PPS endpoint. And now Alex Plaskett will continue with setting up your exploit dev environment.
Hi, cool, thanks Georgie. So yeah, basically that was a good introduction into like the QNX basics, kind of giving an overview on how the platform works. I know it's kind of it's an obscure platform. There's not actually that many people who are like familiar with the architecture. I'm going to talk about more the vulnerability development process, how you go about like what you need to set up, how you go about identifying vulnerabilities, and what we actually found in the platform. So the first stage really is like we wanted to look at it from like a static analysis perspective. We wanted to try like build a tool chain, but Blackberry, QNX, like they don't really make their SDK public. You have to become like a license like subscriber to that. But you can take the tools like GCC, GDB, all the kind of like compilation chain, and basically move that from Blackberry 10 to QNX. And that basically gives you like a working debugger. You can use GDB to attach to processes. You can kind of examine why things have crashed. We also wanted to look at so what do you do like when you get a firmware image? Like how do you go about like unpacking the firmware image? Can you make your own firmware image? That kind of thing. Also, these tools aren't really available unless you're like a QNX subscriber, but for some reason, like on the trial virtual machine, like QNX left them on the VM, so you can just pull them off the VM and use those tools, which is quite handy. There is also the QNX portal, which has got loads of BSP images for the different types of board which QNX supports. So you can examine the bootloaders, the board kind of bring ups, all that kind of thing. And then finally, there's this awesome tool called Sashesi, which someone's made, and it basically allows you to download the firmware images straight from Blackberry and unpack them as well. So how do you go about actually getting a firmware image? Well, I mentioned Sashesi, that kind of automates the process of downloading things, but that's only really for Blackberry 10. For things like QNX car infotainment systems, well, you can get the firmware images from updates. You can often sniff an update process, extract the URLs which are used for the updates, and acquire the firmwares this kind of way. So things like I got hold of the Toyota firmware for the Toyota head units by doing this. You can actually extract images as well from devices. So even if you can't find a firmware image, say you're attacking, I don't know, an embedded, a power plant or something, you probably can't get an update image, but you could take an image from the .boot directory, /.boot. Yeah, and the BSP components I've already mentioned, there's a lot of them already on the QNX website, where if you register, it'll just provide you a download. So that was kind of static analysis. At this point, we can unpack firmware images, we can debug, we can statically reverse engineer things, but bug hunting when kind of in IDA, I mean, it's a slow process. It would be good if you could kind of do some kind of dynamic analysis, and then that way we can see why things have crashed and what actually happened. So what I did was I took the BeagleBoard BSP image and located, say, in this case, it was a Toyota image file system, and I basically combined that with the BSP and created a NAND disk, and then that way I could boot the Toyota head unit under QEMU, which was pretty cool because it meant I could do instrumentation and debugging and stuff under QEMU. So they're the kind of steps which you need to go through. It's not too difficult, but yeah, and you can see the Toyota firmware booting up there under QEMU. But that kind of only allowed me to really do x86. Really, I wanted to create my own kind of custom ARM images as well. So you can do that as well. And using all the tools, you basically create a build script and specify what binaries you want within that build script, and then run the build tools, append your bootloaders, and then boot that in QEMU. That's pretty cool because you can write a fuzzer, you can integrate it with your IFS image, and then run that on the platform. So debugging, what do you do for debugging? If you've got no debug visibility as an exploit dev, it's quite challenging. You have to, when something crashes, you have to trace it back and look at what registers were, what the registers were. It's a lot easier if you can attach your debugger and actually look at stuff rather than just reversing it. We found out on Blackberry 10 at least, they'd done similar to GR security, where there's essentially limited visibility from the user itself. Basically, there's an info leak which we discovered, when you do sysctl-a, that basically lists out all the processes, all the kind of things which are running on the device. We also rooted the simulator because so it's kind of catch-22 when you're an exploit dev. You can't attach to higher privilege processes because you're running as a low privilege process. But if you root the simulator, it gives you root access, and then you can do debugging on x86, and then attach to these higher privilege processes and look for vulnerabilities. So that's kind of how you do it as well. Basically, you can do on-device debugging where you attach to the actual device remotely. So QNA's, GDB is running on your host operating system, and then GDB stubs running on the target. And using a target QNX, you can basically attach to that process. So I wrote some automation to basically do browser fuzzing, so I could do my crash detection on the device itself, pipe all the crashes back to my host, and look at the crash logs like that. Yeah, so that's basically what that looks like. You can't attach to the browser either because the browser is running as a separate UID, which the shell user doesn't really have access to. But if you embed a web view within an application, that'll basically give you all of the rendering components, all of the HTML side of things within your application. I put some code as well on my GitHub for just basically monitoring and crash detection across using this mechanism. So, yeah. So when we initially started looking at the user space, but Blackberry had gone to quite a lot of like effort to lock down the user space. Like in the past, a lot of the vulnerabilities, they were like set UID binaries, they were kind of common Unix problems. But Blackberry had basically removed all set UIDs, all the kind of common ways of doing privilege escalation. So I was like, okay, well, we've looked at looked at user space, then like we might as well check out the kernel, because the kernel, like exploiting the kernels, are, like normally an easy win to get high privilege access on the device. There's the source code for the debugger. It's actually an old version of QNX. It's available online. Like Georgi was saying, Blackberry, well, the source code was available, and then Blackberry did the acquisition and basically closed source it. But I mean, if things were online initially, then you can't really get rid of them. It's like, yeah. So I took the source code from an earlier version of QNX, and I basically took the debug component from that, rebuilt it for a later version of QNX, and ported that into the BSP image. And then that basically gave me kernel debugging on the QNX, like on the latest QNX version, 6.6. That was pretty handy. We also found out you could use VMware and the hypervisor in VMware to inspect the guest memory from the host itself, which is also pretty good. But it's x86. It's not really the same as ARM. Like your vulnerabilities are probably the same, but the exploitation-wise is different because of the platform. So finally, I'm just going to talk about kernel security, how the kernel works, what the differences are, and then I'll talk about some of the vulnerabilities which we actually found. Because it's a microkernel operating system, the actual attack surface is very limited. There's only 85 system calls, as opposed to like Linux is 300-ish. They removed things like the TCP stack, the file systems, the Bluetooth. This is all outside of the kernel, so it reduces your kind of like trusted computing base significantly, and it makes it a lot easier to kind of secure that code base. So, like when you when you want to develop a kernel exploit, you kind of really need to know how the memory mapping works. It's just a typical 32-bit operating system where the lower half of the address space is the user space mapping, and the upper half is the kernel space. They have added some protections in the kernel as well, like there's the null page mapping. So if you've got a null dereference in the kernel, there's actually protection to prevent you from mapping the null page. But there's no KASLR, so there's no randomization of the memory within the kernel address space. And there's also things at a fixed location within the kernel as well. So the trap vector table, the page tables, and so on, these are at fixed locations. So if you've got a kernel vulnerability, then you've got a pretty good idea of where things are in order to kind of hijack the flow of execution. I don't want to like go through this in minute detail, but it's fairly simple. Like that's what a kernel syscall looks like. It moves the syscall number into the registers, and then it executes the SVC ARM instruction to transition between user space and kernel space. So what I did was I reverse engineered all of the kernel syscalls out and wrote a fuzzer for this. So I went through the kernel syscall table and worked out the interfaces and so on for each of the kernel functions. The pattern kernel, like the functions, they kind of look similar. They perform validation on the data which is passed to check that it's actually within like the right address space and so on. But yeah, my kernel fuzzer, well, my syscall fuzzer, that's available online as well and on my GitHub. So, yeah. So finally, what did we find in this research then? After all of this, so the IPC subsystem was a lot weaker than we thought it would be. Simple like dumb mutation fuzzing would just cause the device to, like the UI to crash. The phone would reboot. You could prevent like incoming phone calls. It didn't seem like super robust, but when we were doing the kind of static analysis, we found out that like Blackberry had kind of prioritized the vulnerabilities themselves. Like they'd left like mainly the reliability issues, but they'd fixed like most of the memory corruption issues, which we found. But I mean, if your QNX runs in some like security and safety critical systems, like if you've got a reliability bug and someone crashes your power plant, it's probably not cool. So yeah, yeah. So we also found out you could like IPCSquad, similar to Windows name pipe squatting, where you hijack the endpoints and then you can sniff the messages which go to those things. There's no kind of validation of where the messages go. And we can do things like we could crash the phone service and block incoming calls, which, yeah. Then from the PPS side, we found just like some kind of like stupid logic bugs where you could like drive the Windows manager. You could basically spawn things on the Windows manager. We found like a command where you could just be like, hey, I want to kill all applications, and the phone would just go, yeah, sure, why not? Like, and then everything would just die. So Blackberry were like, yeah, that's not good. Like, we should fix this. But generally, it's a lot of reliability issues, but not too many kind of memory corruption security ones so far. When I was doing, I had to look through the source code of the 6.5 kernel as well. I found 2 exploitable issues, which were definitely exploitable. Out of like maybe like 6 kind of memory corruption issues at least. I found a perfect bug, but it looks like Blackberry, when they did the acquisition as well, they'd found the same bug, they spotted the same thing, and they fixed that bug. But you can still use this vulnerability really to attack other older QNX systems, and I don't believe that, yeah, which might be useful if you're not attacking a Blackberry device, but some other QNX device. I've got some issues with Blackberry currently as well, which I can't talk about, unfortunately, because they haven't patched them, so, yeah. So this vulnerability, like, this was quite cool, because it was like an arbitrary write what where primitive. It literally, in user space, you would choose what address you want to write to, and what value you want the data to be written to. It's in the emulation of compare exchange functionality. So this was perfect, because this was just like, yeah, I'll just point this at like the ARM EVT and like override that, and then trigger that, and then that would get me code execution within the kernel, which is was quite cool. So that's kind of what exploitation of this issue would look like. You basically pass the address you want it to write to. So in this case, it was the reset vector. The value you want to compare. If you know what that data is already, then it'll just write whatever value the attacker controls to that address. And that kind of demonstrates that overwriting the ARM EVT was possible as well on QNX. It's kind of a common ARM exploitation technique, this, so yeah. So finally, like, what are the next stages of this research? Well, we would have liked to have booted the Blackberry 10 kernel in QEMU, but I'm not an embedded software developer. Like, I think creating the drivers, emulation, and so on in QEMU, I don't think that would be an easy task. I think it would be like fairly time-consuming thing. It was probably easier to port things like Debug to ARM. We've got a lot of crashes we need to triage, like this, a lot of fuzzing, but because we're kind of doing it mainly static analysis, like mainly from a static perspective, automation of the crashes and like looking at the crashes is quite challenging. Yeah, we'd like to improve the fuzzers. We'd also like to look at Android priv in comparison, because although Blackberry have switched from Blackberry 10 now to Android, they've moved some of the concepts, some of the software which they were using on Blackberry 10 to the Android to BlackBerry Android as well in the priv. So in general, like, I think BlackBerry were fairly responsive to fixing the issues. They were, as a vendor, they were easy to work with. They were quite on top of things. I think that the code itself, it was fairly robust and high quality against memory corruption, but there's definitely still reliability issues there. And if it's like a safety critical system, then it's probably not as good. The lack of debug visibility, like if I'm developing an embedded platform and I want to secure it, then making it hard for exploit devs to debug is actually a really quick win you can do, because it means that it slows the attacker down significantly. We didn't find like too many interesting crashes, but it was more about the methodology, like the kind of approach we took for performing assessment of QNX and how you could apply this to lots of different QNX platforms. Maybe they just spent all of their marketing budget on security, who knows? So yeah, there's lots of like previous research. It's mainly been on the playbook, but not too much on BlackBerry 10 itself or QNX. And QNX is becoming more popular now, so things like the exploitation of the Jeep head units and so on. QNX is more, and Julio as well, who's here today. So yeah, all right. So yeah, thanks guys. We've published a white paper. It's like 60-page white paper on this. It's in a lot more depth, and we've released all of our code as well for this, like all of the tools we developed throughout this process as well. So, are there any questions? Okay. Fine. All right, thank you.